that sometimes, it really just fell off the radar about even thinking about theories of teaching as well. And sometimes I would find pedagogy was used in a session or in some kind of event or lecture, and I thought, but I'm not entirely even sure what you mean. I know I should know, but I'm not 100% sure. So I did double check on that as well. And pedagogy is the theory of teaching, but also how that then actually happens in the classroom. So it's the method of how you teach. That is what we're talking about here. And as Lou has said, my background, first of all, in textile design, and then in teaching in secondary art and design, and then 10 years in a special needs school, and then latterly setting up a social enterprise all about making art accessible, led me immediately to start typing in words like creativity and inclusivity as well, to see what the pedagogies were around those areas. And I actually wasn't finding something that hit the spot, because we're living in a world where things have changed, and things that maybe we would think were settled or established in the past are now a bit up in the air. And so I wanted to find something that felt like it really did suit now when we are all negotiating our way through times of a pandemic, and where we are beginning to talk about things going back to normal, but then we're also talking about how children are going to catch up, in inverted commas, and we're also talking about health and well-being and mental health being very important, and catch up and health and well-being at times could be quite conflicting things. So I wanted to find something that was quite relevant to now. And what I homed in on that seemed to really fit the bill was a pedagogy called positive teaching, the behavioural approach. And this pedagogy was written up in 1984 by Kevin Weldall and Frank Merritt, and it's really sort of started in Australia. And don't worry about maybe not being able to copy down exact names or anything just now, because Lou's got it well in hand that you will receive all the information that you need. So what I'm hoping this afternoon is that we can raise some awareness around the main aspects of positive teaching, that we can begin to think a bit about what we say and the actions that we take in our lives as well as our working lives. And that as an engagement artist or a teacher or a leader or an academic, we might think about, by the end of this afternoon, trying one thing that is a wee bit different and making that first little step. So that's what I hope for this afternoon. And I'm going to, base it around the idea of positive teaching. And then I actually realised that very early in my secondary teaching career in the mid-90s, I had actually gone through a programme of positive teaching. And I thought largely that I'd forgotten about it. But then by studying it again, I realised that in actual fact, it was really part of all my teaching from then on. So it had been something that really was an influence. I was part of a small group in a secondary school, and we went through a whole programme of positive teaching. And it was because it's called the behavioural approach, it was largely about altering the sorts of behaviours that you will find in a group or in a class, where it's things that almost interrupt learning, and they happen very regularly as well. It can be someone shouting out, can be someone fidgeting, it can be somebody not engaging with what you're doing. And so it was based around a kind of behaviour model. But I actually think now, the position we're in at the moment, if we're going to work with any groups in a school, in a gallery, in a community setting, our main thing that we can bring is a way of encouraging people to engage. I would actually think that not feeling engaged is actually more of an issue that positive teaching could help to address now than maybe it was before. So the first thing that we actually had to do when we embarked on this positive teaching course was actually to become aware of how many times we actually say something negative. And you can think of yourself as quite a chirpy person, but in certain situations, you can very quickly, it can become a habit to concentrate on the negative, to reply in the negative to things that are happening around you. And what we actually had to do that you wouldn't have to do unless you actually felt like doing it was, we had a little clicker that would count numbers, and we had to have that in our pocket. And you chose a class that you were having, an issue with. And I did have a particularly tricky class with 17 boys and 3 girls in it. And I decided I wanted to work with that class. And what you initially did was just have that clicker, and when you were saying something that was negative, you clicked. And it was amazing how many times you were actually resorting to giving attention to the thing that was, not positive, and you were responding in a negative way as well. And that then moved on to thinking a wee bit about, well, how could you change your language, and B, change maybe some of your planning and your approaches, so that you could really get on with things, and you could minimize the negative interactions that you were having. And what I wanted to do was, at each, I'm going to have about 3 stages, I think, that we're going to go through this afternoon. And the first stage is us just being aware, maybe, of the sorts of language that we are using, and really culturally how we tend to dwell on the negative. And I had here a little book. I was clearing out my mum's flat, and I found a book here, and it says "Lies and Truths My Mother Told Me." And I know everyone here isn't from Scotland, and I don't actually think it's unique to Scotland at all. But some of these phrases, it was also said, "Your Scottish mother's favourite sayings." And I started to read through them, and we had the old classics like "Be careful what you wish for," and "If I've told you once, I've told you a million times," and "You'll poke your eye out with that thing," and "Make sure you're wearing clean underwear in case you have an accident." My mum has said that to me when I was younger. And "The straighten your face, because if the wind changes, it'll stay like that." And we have all these sort of phrases that maybe they're not used constantly, but they're there kind of in the background of your culture, and they get passed down. And there were some really obscure ones. There was "Don't wear jewellery that makes a noise," and "You've got a sore throat because you don't wear your gloves." So I don't know how you were meant to link those two. And "whistling in the house," apparently, it got mentioned 3 times. And whistling in the house was described as encouraging mice, giving you hairs on your chin, or stopping your hair growing completely. So whistling in the house, my goodness. And I know that some of these are a bit funny as well, but if you are always hearing things like that, then you maybe don't even have the language to speak in a different way and speak in a more positive way. So what I thought we would do now is have a wee think about one of these phrases, and it's the one that says, you're going to take your eye out with that thing. And I have got my scissors here, big scissors, because I would sort of like to say that a lot of these phrases, although they were negative, they came from a point of view of trying to maybe protect someone or trying to impart some knowledge. It wasn't just about being mean. And so the thing about you'll poke your eye out with that, and I thought about an example of if we're teaching artists, if we've got any kind of activity going on or whatever, and it might not be the exact words we say, but we could be good about saying what not to do, and you know, what not to touch or not use or whatever. And the thing is, if you're saying to someone, especially maybe someone younger or someone with additional support needs, and you say something like, you could poke your eye out with that, that's quite a scary thing. And so what you learn from that is, oh, this is, you know, maybe something I don't want to engage with. It's something that, oh, I could hurt myself with it. And there's no kind of excitement about, oh, but what could I do with it as well? That could be really creative. And just as an example with that, it could be this, it could be a sharp stick, it could be many things. But what about if, and I'm holding them up in the air, and this isn't exactly what you want to do, because you could poke your eye out with them. But what about if, for a start, when you're bringing out the scissors with a group or a class or whatever, you tell people what to do with them instead. And so you say, hold the scissors like this, hold them down if you're walking, or if you're handing them to someone, you keep them closed and you hold the blades and you hand them over. So you've actually, instead of you know, going in there straight away with the disaster that might happen, you've given people some knowledge instead. Because we cannot assume knowledge. We can't assume prior knowledge all the time. And I do remember a friend of mine who worked on the travelling gallery, worrying once about the content of a talk she was going to give, and then realised that there was a picture and it had thistles in it, and half the children didn't know what a thistle was. So times are changing. We can't assume that everybody is necessarily going to have handled a lot of tools, for instance. So I'm now going to set you just a little bit of a thinking task around the idea of, think of something that it might be a class you're regularly working with, it might be a group you're about to take, or a workshop you do or whatever, and have a wee think about, is there something that you can almost hear yourself? If there's perhaps a negative thing that you hear often or you find yourself saying, and is there an alternative way that you could say it? And nobody is going to be put on the spot to say what they have you know, decided to choose, and you can even save that for later. You can maybe even just make a wee note about what it was, and then when you are aware of it, you can tap into that then. So it's just, yes, what might you have said instead, or what could, if you've been the recipient of something that really is, you know, about don't do this or quite negative, what would you rather that person had said to you? What would actually have been useful if they'd worded it differently? And I'll just sort out my next thing while you have a wee think about that. So here we are. Right. And I'm quite sure, as I say, I had this little book and it was about Scottish sayings, but I'm actually sure it's lots of other cultures have something very similar. Okay, so what I really wanted to highlight from that is the first part is what you say matters, or what is said matters. So this is a bit about words. What is said matters. And of what I have got here is, it's just a wee story. I'm going to get the big storybook out here, and I have got just something. It's from a book called, well, the actual book that I got the story from was called The Art of Being Brilliant. But it's just quite a wee interesting story that deals with your words and how your words matter. And if you realise that your words matter, then you as an individual matter as well, because we might think at the moment there's an awful lot that's out of our hands, and curriculums can sometimes feel out of our hands, world events can feel out of our hands, but we really can make a difference with our words. So this is just a little story about it was a man who owned some horses, actually, and it just so happened that the school bus stopped right at the gate of his horse's field. And while he was at work, the school children used to feed the horses all their scraps. They used to get Mars bars and crisps and stuff that the kids made in their cookery class. And the horses, actually, they developed a liking for pepperoni pizza. And over time, the horses got fat. So the man put up a sign. He thought, you need to do something about this. So he puts up a sign and it said, do not feed the horses. And did it work? No, it didn't work. And the kids still kept on feeding the horses all the rubbishy food, and it didn't make any difference. So he changed the sign a little bit, and it got a bit bolder, and it went, please don't feed the horses, exclamation mark, because by this point it's getting more annoying. But did this work? It didn't work. And he lived in the same village as one of the folk that wrote the book, you know, about being brilliant. And so he said to him, you know, you're into positive psychology and everything like that. What am I to do? You know, I can't get them to stop feeding the horses the food I don't want them to get. And so he wrote down a few words on a scrap of paper and said, put that on your sign. And you know this, the horses, they're now back to their normal weight, their coats are shining, their energy is restored. And if you go past the field, this is the sign you will see. We only eat apples and carrots. Because it's really straightforward and it's really simple, and it tells you what to do instead of what not to do. And although that might seem like a very simple thing to suggest, it's difficult to do. It's not easy, and you'll not remember that all the time. You'll not pull it off every day, but it's a good thing to have in your mind that if you tell people what it is you do want them to do, then it saves an awful lot of time and energy as well, and an awful lot of frustration on your part too. So it's a good one to have up your sleeve and to try out, I would say. Where I've found it works quite well in galleries with groups that come in and you don't know the group very well, you're not maybe going to meet them again, so you've not got the time like a class teacher to build up knowledge of the group and a rapport. And you're always striking a balance between this being a fun day or somebody touching the paintings or, you know, doing some damage or whatever, and the security people not being pleased about you and your tour. But if you're able to say something like, this is where we'll stand to look at this picture, it's how you get the best view of it, and you say that very confidently, then people are more likely to go along with that. Because there's it's a phrase we used to use a lot in the special needs school I worked in, where the children had severe and complex learning difficulties, and many of them were non-verbal or had very limited understanding of the spoken or written word. We would say you can't process a negative. Because if I was to say to someone, don't touch that paint that's out on the work surface just now, the word don't is quite abstract, but the phrase that might be remembered is touch that paint. And everybody, once that's in your head, you can't get that out of your head, can you? If I was to say, whatever you do, don't think about why there's an easel behind me with no picture on it, then you're going to have at least a wee thought about why that might be. So the idea that people don't process negatives well is actually, it's really valid, and it really can work for you if you reword things. So what you say can really, really matter. And now we'll move on to part 2, because this is the next bit. What you notice really matters. And this taps into the part of positive psychology and positive teaching, where what we're essentially doing here, in the way I see it, we're changing perceptions. And the good thing about this kind of approach as well is you don't have to go off and buy a whole load of new resources. It can sit in alongside either your curriculum or your workshop programme or your training programme that you're already doing, but it's just another really nice way of thinking about it slightly differently. Because if we are sitting with a group, or say we today we're here on our Zoom group, and all of a sudden someone, shouted out within the group, we would notice that, wouldn't we? And we would maybe say something about it. So the person who shouted the thing out might think, well, this is a way to get attention, isn't it? If I sit here quietly, nobody's noticing. If I shout out, even although it might be irrelevant, it might be annoying, I'm going to get some attention. And this is how it can work in groups. And it's also how something can end up with someone perhaps ending up with a label that they are the person who shouts out, and you almost end up that you're anticipating it for the next time, and you're waiting to come in again with perhaps another negative reply. And an actual really important bit about positive teaching was kind of training yourself to notice other things. And this is where it's quite a subtle thing as well, because it's not just praising people. And that's where positive psychology and positive teaching have been given a bit of a bad press as well, because you could equally think, oh, it's about not addressing behaviours, or it's about just letting people off with things, or it's about lowering your standards or whatever like that. All these things can be thrown at it. But it's actually none of these things when you really look into it. If there are ever times when there is, really important behaviours that need addressed, things that really are serious, someone is going to get hurt, or hurt themselves, or you, all these things need addressed, and certain things that are said or done, you don't just completely ignore them. I'm talking about the things that are just, they're kind of maybe just bubble under the surface all the time, but you can minimize them by drawing attention to something else. So look for the person in your group who is not shouting out, who is being rather quiet, who is going under the radar. Find something to say to them. The person who perhaps does get the negative attention for the shouting out, wait and notice something else that they do that you can comment on. So it's not always the same thing that you are commenting on. And that also even applies to someone who is always praised for the same thing, and is always told that this one thing that they do is the good thing, because then they can start to either need that to be able to do something, or they can see themselves as, this is the thing I'm good at, so I'm not good at the other things. So it's quite a creative and quite interesting thing to do, to look for things that are happening that you maybe wouldn't usually notice. And look for ways that you can catch somebody doing something that is a positive thing. And then the important thing is that you name it. You actually say it. And say it as soon as you can after you've noticed the thing happening as well, and the connection is there. Because if you want to tell somebody they've done something well, if you use something like just good job or something like that, it's too vague. It doesn't really give much information to the recipient. And also, it doesn't really sound maybe genuine as well. And I think this is the important thing about when you perhaps notice things and you want to highlight them. It's really got to be things that you genuinely do notice and that you are feeling genuine about saying. But you know, once you say one, you know, you can build on that as well. It might feel slightly awkward initially, you know, maybe to say something good about someone that you've been having a bit of a hard time with, but it's well worth doing. It really is, and it has knock-on effects all the way through. And so therefore, if you can notice something maybe about done and you're quite specific and you're quite genuine, you are giving that person some vocabulary about themselves that they can then internalize, because you internalize negative things really quickly. You need something to kind of counteract that. The other thing is, if you are saying something to someone, they are not the only person that hears it. The rest of the group will hear it as well. And what you're doing then is you're in a win-win, because you are providing vocabulary and you're providing ideas for everyone else as well. And that is so valuable, because within groups, the groups themselves kind of put people in categories and define them quite quickly. And they define who they make fun of, or who they think isn't good enough, or who draws well, who doesn't, who's good at sport, all these things. You know, really, we all divide ourselves up pretty brutally and pretty quickly. And if we're never offered an alternative way to see these people, then it can't come through. So I think as a leader, even if you are there and you think, I'm here to do art things, and I am here to be, you know, I'm here to do creative things, and we're here to get this painting done or whatever, there's a much wider role that you can have. And I also think it's actually a very creative role. Creative people, well, perhaps the nature of their work encourages them to think of alternatives and think in different ways. And they can very often be the people who think in different ways. So you can do a really important job. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to do a wee screen share, and it's another thing to just think about, because, and hopefully it's just coming up now. Hopefully should be sharing with you any second now. Lou or Sam, can you give me a wee shout if it's appeared?
It's up. That's all good, Heather.
It's up. Brilliant. That's great. I'm not seeing any sort of folk down the side in boxes yet, but I'm assuming that you can see some dandelions and you can hear what I am saying. And it's just another little thought, because as artists, we often see ordinary things in a different way in our work. And we can also pick on things that everyone else might not necessarily think is beautiful or useful or important. And that's why I kind of picked a dandelion, because in a way we can often think of dandelions as annoying, as a nuisance, as we sometimes people can be as well. But every one of these pictures has something different about it, and it's at all different stages. So no two dandelions here are looking the same or at the same stage. And that could be a wee metaphor for a group. And what to do is just again to yourself in your own thoughts, have a wee look at each of these pictures of the dandelion and have a little think in your head. What do you notice about each one? What could you be noticing that you could maybe then put into words and voice about that dandelion? That is the special quality there. It doesn't have to be the one that's in full bloom, looking the brightest, to have something about it that is special. So we'll just take a wee minute to take a look at that, have a wee think. What are you noticing about these images? Okay. Now I'm going to come back out of the screen share. Again, that is something that, you know, it needn't have taken long. It just illustrates perhaps a wee bit of almost training yourself to think slightly differently. And then we'll move on to what I'm calling part 3, because we've done what you say, we've done what you notice, and now I'm going to have you think about what you do, your actions, because the positive teaching pedagogy, when you look into it, it's based largely around what we've kind of covered already, and how you interact with a class and how you talk to them. But I would say that there are other ways to be positive, and there are other ways to really make the most of this idea. And it's by actions. It's about what you set up. It's about how your environment's organised, and it's about how you essentially kind of plan in your head the things that you're doing. And I'm going to borrow a wee bit from directly from when I was teaching in the special needs school again, and we used visual timetables, and you might be quite familiar with them depending on your setting. And sorry, that noise that you are hearing is the noise of the Velcro. I always wished when I was at St. Crispin's, I thought if I had shares in Velcro, I would be so rich, because we used a lot of it. Now, as I say, some of you might be familiar with this, some not, and therefore, sorry if I'm going over old ground with you, but it might also be new to you as well. If you find being given a lot of written instructions, or if I was to tell you any more than about 2 or 3 things to do in a list, it can be very hard to remember them. It can be very hard for all of us to remember them. But if you have any kind of learning disability, if you are young, or if you are easily distracted, if you have a medical condition that makes concentration difficult, if you're feeling uncomfortable, all these will add up to difficulties with just, you know, going through a list or remembering a list. So what you can have instead is you can put together a timetable for children, and it's visual. And I'm going to show you some of the images that are in standard use on visual timetables, and they are called board maker symbols. And if you're, say, in your lesson, you're wanting someone to be looking at something, you would have a symbol for that. So you might start your lesson and you want everybody to be looking at something. And they don't go into great detail. It's a shorthand for what you're doing. And then that day, maybe you'd be looking at the dandelions, but then you might want to concentrate on, well, it's the lines we're looking for. Where are we seeing the lines and the shape of these lines in the dandelions? So you've kind of again been quite clear about what it is we're looking at. If we're looking at the lines, we're not going to then go nitpicking over somebody using a different colour or something like that. You know, you kind of be clear about what you're doing. And then we might decide that we are going to do a bit of drawing. So you might put that in as well. And essentially then your lesson looks like three things. You're going to look at perhaps the dandelion picture, you're going to notice where the lines are, and then you're going to begin to draw some of them. And for one session, that might just be enough. And so it's been a positive move to reduce what it is that you are aiming to home in on in that particular lesson. It doesn't mean that you don't care about colour, and it doesn't mean that you don't want to do collage one day, and it doesn't mean that you do not think it's important that people learn about tone for an exam or something like that. But if you try and throw all of that in at once all the time, you fall into what people are not doing, and you confuse matters as well. So I also think, though, it helps us. It helps us with our planning. And you may or may not have the board maker symbols in wherever it is you work. And if you don't worry. You've got just 1, 2, 3. And this is on just a piece of board with some Velcro. So I can take these on and off. So I could have pictures, I might have photographs, or you could just simply have 1, 2, 3, or for your own planning, you could draw that on a piece of paper and have that as well. And what it does is it makes you realise what are the main things that I'm trying to do today, and what do I not have to focus on today. And I think it can make you more effective. It also frees you up, because if you've got that there as your kind of core, your base for the day, then if someone asks something different or someone does something different, you've got the room to go with it, because you've not micromanaged every part of what you've been doing. So I would be a sort of big advocate of doing something like that is also positive teaching in action as well. What I would also say is, if you do use the likes of the board maker symbols with your groups that you work with, sometimes it can be that you set them up and you think this is what we use for the children with the additional support needs, and you do something different for everyone else, and then you feel like I've got extra work now because now I've got to do this for the children who need it. But in actual fact, everybody could understand this bit, couldn't they? So it's the long list you don't need to do. Everybody can understand this bit, including it helping you with your planning. So it also is a positive way for you to work in including people, because it kind of does include everyone, and it doesn't stop anyone from going into things in more depth or asking more complicated or less complicated questions. You can explore all of these things, but you've not excluded someone from the beginning. So it's something that I feel that it does work. It really does work, because I've worked with children where that was really necessary, because otherwise you were not going to have any level of understanding. But I actually think I would use it myself as well. So it really does work. Now, I'm just looking at the time here, and it has gone so fast. Just one more thing in the, the actions of what you can do as well is, I suppose, to sum up, when you're using perhaps that 1, 2, 3 thing, there's another way that you can use if you're feeling a bit overwhelmed as well, or if people you are working with look like they're feeling a bit overwhelmed, because I think that's going to be quite a common feeling that we're all going to experience at some point, or have done over the past year, maybe more than ever. I think, stresses still happened before, but we've got them all piled on now. And especially if you're being asked to catch up with things as well, it can all seem a bit much. And everyone from Caitlin Moran to Confucius agrees with this as well, not just positive teaching. And not just in special needs schools. If you can, in a time of feeling really quite overwhelmed, before there's even perhaps a meltdown or an incident, if you just reduce the position you're in right now is to now and next. And next is the one, it can be the tiniest, smallest step that you take next. And you've at that moment in time, you stop thinking about everything else. You stop thinking about all the deadlines and all the problems and the massive things. They're still there. They don't disappear as if by magic. But what this does is you get over that feeling of being overwhelmed. And it's a very positive thing to do. It's different from being praised and told, oh, you're good, you can do it, you'll manage. That might not help at that moment in time. You just need to know, what is that next tiny step I'm going to take? So again, a really sort of, a good takeaway. And I have used that recently as well, because, when things are whirling around in your head, and that can happen to anybody, you can just buy yourself that little bit of breathing space. I have done a lot of knitting stripes, I have to say, because if you get a wee task that you can just go off and you can just do a wee row or two, that can reset you as well. It's about resetting yourself. It's about giving that battery a little bit of time to recharge. It's not about ignoring what needs to be done. It's about being better placed to deal with it. And very lastly, for me, if positive teaching is about anything, for the way I like to work, it's about value. I've done a lot of thinking during the past year about what we value, why we value it, what value actually is. I have even been inspired by the dandelions, and I have got a little vase of dandelions sitting in my house at all its different stages. Instead of thinking that they have to be defeated and removed, I'm celebrating them. And I think what we value has maybe been up for grabs more recently, and there will be conflicting views about what we value, but I think positive teaching is a way of perhaps recognising the value in some people that we tend to ignore, and I'd love to use it that way.